The Ottoman Empire, after really 1620, 1650, is falling apart bit by bit, and its enemies are pressing closer, and they're taking chunks of land, the Crimea, the Ukraine, the Balkans, Greece. All these chunks fall off the Ottoman Empire. It progressively gets weaker, and it's called the sick man of Europe. They're not technologically competitive with the Europeans. They have no money. They're broke. They got to borrow money. They can't pay it back. They don't have an industrial base. Their agricultural setup is antique and doesn't work well either. So it is not quite a basket case, but it is widely known as the sick man of Europe. Okay. They've got insurgency problems. There are 10 million ethnic Turks in an empire of 22 million people. So the sum total of the minorities of the empire exceed that of the people who might call themselves ethnic Turks. After 1877, they live in a condition of persistent war. We have that today. You hear it if you read the news accounts about American military policy. We've been in Afghanistan since 2001. We were in Iraq 2003 to 2011. Now we're going back. So persistent war, it's a modern term, but you understand what it means. And you understand the effect it has on the country that has to wage it. These people are besieged by their own population. And there are Armenian rebellions at different times in Constantinople and in eastern Anatolia. The Bulgarians, then called the Macedonians, partly raised rebellions in the Balkans. The Kurds, always in rebellion, still in rebellion. Yemen, a running sore even today. The Idris rebellion, the problems in Yemen. Crete, Greek rebellion on Crete. Arabia, the Sharif, the Arabian tribes of Arabs, often in rebellion in this period. They owned Libya up until 1911. The Senussis, tribal people in Libya, are in rebellion. Albanians in rebellion. It goes on and on and on for about a 25 or 30 year sustained period. What's their response? Their response is to send in the army. A phrase I teach my students: resources determine policy. The amount of resources you have determine how you can respond or be proactive, whatever you want to pick, to execute a certain policy. The army is a big army and is a kinetic response. What do I mean by that? This is not hearts and minds of the people. Nobody goes into villages in Yemen and says, let me drill you a well and we'll make the marketplace safe and maybe we'll lessen the possibility of a rebellion. How they do this is to send in 20, 30, 100,000 Ottoman soldiers, and it's a kinetic response. That means they kill people indiscriminately often. But they solve the problem by sending in the army. Not much different than what the Germans do in Africa, not much different than what the Russians do in parts of their empire, not much different than what we do against the American Indians in our own country. It works up to a certain level. You kill them all, this generation, next generation, they come back. You go send in the army again, you kill them all. So it's a moving train and kind of a sine curve. It is a counterinsurgency strategy that nobody likes to use anymore for obvious reasons. So this has been discarded by all the Western powers today. So counterinsurgency doctrine today, as the United States practices it, does not look like this. Something different. Okay, who are we talking about as an insurgent? Most of the rebellions that I showed on the previous slide are tribal elements. They're under tribal leaders. In the European provinces and in Anatolia, the core provinces of the Ottoman Empire, the places that count, if you will, they're not so concerned about Yemen. They would like to retain it, but if they lose it, it's not going to kill them. If they lose Bulgaria and Macedonia or Anatolia, the empire is almost finished. What happens in these provinces is that the nature of rebellion is not tribal. It is highly organized and tightly controlled by what we call the committees. The Ottomans know these as komitija. And that's the word that they use. It's a common word in the Ottoman Empire. The Young Turks themselves are members of the Committee of Union and Progress, itself a revolutionary terrorist organization that overthrows the government with a coup d'etat. So they're a part of this. The two committees that are of most concern in the early 20th century are the Macedonians, in what's now Macedonia and Western Bulgaria, and the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. So the one I'll talk about, a concern for this, and the book, let me just tell you a little bit about the book. The book spends 3 chapters about all of the rebellions that I showed up there. The book spends a chapter on insurgency by committee and how the committees are organized. These are typical pictures of the members of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. They're heavily armed. They use signature costume and bandoliers. They frequently have banners that are almost always red and have Marxist, not Leninist, but Marxist socialist slogans on them. They are, in today's vocabulary, a terrorist organization. How do we know that? Because they publish manifestos that are explicit in the idea that we can't win against the Ottomans by a mass rebellion by people. They'll send in the army and we'll be crushed. In fact, the nature of rebellion in Europe itself after 1848 changes significantly. There are massive rebellions in Europe in 1830, massive rebellions in Europe in 1848. They're crushed. The Council of Europe just takes them off the table. Marx, Engels, those guys flee. What happens to insurgency? What happens if you're unhappy living under the Germans, the Russians, the Austro-Hungarians, the British, the French, or the Ottomans? Well, you form a clandestine group. You form a revolutionary cell, a committee. You form a secret society. And it starts with the nihilists in Russia in the 1860s, and the anarchists in Italy, and the Black Hand in what's now Bosnia, and the committees in the Ottoman Empire. They're common. How do we talk about, how do we understand the committees? They understand that a popular rebellion cannot win independence or autonomy for the empire of which they are a part of. How then do you achieve such a condition? Well, you go to a terrorism agenda. How does terrorism work? You bomb, assassinate, interdict, upset, disrupt the local economy and the infrastructure with what they call propaganda by deed, heinous acts. What this does is then force the oppressive regime, any of the empires that happen to be involved in these, to overreact. And then the overreaction brings in the great powers. So, the Ottoman state overreacts, and they're being watched carefully by the Russians, the British, the French, and the Germans. This causes those great powers to intervene in Ottoman affairs. So it's a strategy that the Dashnaks and the Hunchaks, the two primary Armenian committees, adopt and adapt and refine. We know this because we have their manifestos. We know this because we have the newspapers they publish. Where does this information come from? It doesn't come from the Turks. The Turks know this, of course. The Ottomans know this, but if you read the great Armenian writers who write about the committees, Louise Nalbandian, Harash Dashnigian, Tikran Kaligian, when you read their books all about the committees, you'll find this out. So, well-known stuff. This is one of their manifestos from 1895. It commits them to violence. It commits them to propaganda by deed. It commits them to stimulate fighting and terrorize governments, informers, traitors, usurers, and every kind of exploiter. They're organized in a cellular architecture. So the committees, as in a pyramid, there are people on top, and there are a whole bunch of small cells at the bottom, none of whom know who are in the cells in the adjacent city. So this is an Al-Qaeda-like structure. It's a Hamas-like structure. It's a Hezbollah-like structure. It's the same structure the Black Hand has that knocks off the Archduke Ferdinand on 28 June 1914. It's the same structure the nihilists have and the anarchists have in Russia and in Italy. So it is a organizational architecture that goes back to the 1860s that's still in use today. What's it designed to do? It's designed to create secrecy and safety for the members so they won't be hunted down and killed by the government. Again, the organizational chart comes from a close reading of the great Armenian authors who happen to write about this subject. They smuggle arms. They bring weapons. Europe is awash with weapons. And there are internal organizers. There are external support groups. You're familiar with terrorism today, that we always follow the money. Where does Al-Qaeda get its money? If we can stop the money, if we can stop the weapons at the source, we weaken Al-Qaeda. Well, the committees have branches in Tbilisi and in Paris and in London, and they collect money from the Armenian communities in those cities, and they buy weapons, and they smuggle the weapons into the Ottoman Empire. These are, and from both sides, these are the smuggling routes from the Caucasus. There are smuggling routes from Bulgaria into Thrace. The hub of the arms smuggling trade in Thrace is Tekkerdok, and this is well known. That's what they look like. They're kind of a bourgeois look. They aren't peasants, are they? Educated men. The Armenian and Jewish committees, not committees, but the Armenian and Jewish communities in the Ottoman Empire are much more highly educated than the Muslims. They value education. They are literate. They have alphabets and a literature and poetry. Muslim Turks, most of them, 90% of them, 95% of them don't read. They're professionals. They're lawyers. They're doctors. They're public officials. They work on the railway. They are men of importance in the community. I think this group is from Van. And I think that because of the signature Mauser pistols that they're carrying. We know today that in April 1915, in the city of Van, and I'll talk about this in just a second, they used hundreds of those types of pistols. You can put a stock on it in a magazine, what you would call today an extended magazine, and you've got now a very powerful weapon. And that's the signature weapon of the revolt in Van. So I know they're Armenians. I don't know where they're from. I think they're from Van, 1912, 1913. But they're kind of a bourgeois in the sense of being middle class. They're not peasants. This is not a peasant rebellion. What's important to know about the committees? They're well organized. They're indoctrinated. They have classes on Marxist socialist thought. They have classes on autonomy and independence. They have classes on the manifesto. I mean, they're indoctrinated in the same way that all revolutionary armies indoctrinate their men. They're committed to revolutionary goals. They're willing to use any means necessary. Don't believe me? Read the writers. Read the manifestos. Read what they do. This is part of the mystique of being in this group. They're externally supported. Their leadership includes intelligentsia and notables. That's who leads the group. Okay, what's important that most people miss about the committees, that some people miss in this lecture? Membership is limited. How many Armenians are in the committees? Well, not very many. To be honest, most Armenians are fairly happy living in their cities, living and participating in the Ottoman economy. The Jews and the Armenians live a better life than the Muslim Turks. That's a fact. So it's not attractive to be a committeeman. You take your life in your hands. Are you so unhappy with your life that you're going to join a revolutionary committee? Most don't. Most Ottoman Armenians were not members. Most Ottoman Armenians are loyal citizens and remain so throughout the conduct of the war. Large numbers of Ottoman Armenian men served in the Ottoman army up until 1918. honorably and faithfully. It's a great untold story that somebody needs to go out there and research. So, important point. Small group of people. This is where Ed changes his view. I thought it was a pretty big insurgency. It's a small group. Where do they live? Most Armenians, they live everywhere in the empire, of course. However, most of them live in two principal areas. One is eastern Anatolia, and the other is in Thrace, in the area around Constantinople. The Armenians who live in eastern Anatolia are Ottoman subjects. There's a whole bunch more living in the Caucasus, the modern Republic of Armenia, who are Russian subjects. The committees oppose both. So there are Armenian Ottoman subjects in Ottoman lands who are committeemen. There are counterparts in Russia who are Armenians who would like to achieve autonomy from the Tsar. Okay. Shifting gears, the Ottoman army. What happens as we leave the summer of 1914, going into the spring of 1915, and the actual relocation? The Ottoman army is a peasant army. It's composed of unindustrialized, illiterate, agrarian people. They're not like the British, the French army, the American army of the time. They live in cantonment areas, garrison cities spread all across Anatolia, just like the modern army in France, Germany, or Turkey today. Everybody is in a small town in a little garrison behind the gates. They train, they go out, they take care of their equipment, and in peacetime, that's what they do. Occasionally, they'll leave for a major peacetime maneuver. But the point is they're distributed widely through the empire. That serves two purposes. One, it makes them easier to sustain. The other is, if there's a problem in the neighborhood, we've got soldiers available. If I've got problems down in Arabia, I've got Ottoman soldiers right there. I can just send 20,000 of the boys out to stamp out the rebellion. So the idea that resources determine policy is important. That the distribution of the army for all major powers also has an internal security aspect. So that's where the soldiers come from who would go out and suppress the rebellion. The Ottomans don't start the war, or rather don't engage in the war until November, although the war starts in August. And in August, even though they're not combatants, they start to mobilize the army. And what happens is that the garrisons, after 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks of mobilization, start to move to the frontiers, because the army is going to fight on the frontiers. The German Schlieffen Plan, after 2 weeks, moves the German army from all over Germany. 7/8 of the army goes to the Belgian border. And we call that concentration. And the army concentrates along the frontiers until it looks like that. Out of 36 combat divisions, 24 of them wind up either on the Russian frontier or in Bulgaria, facing the Bulgarians and the Greeks. The rest go to Palestine, the Sinai Peninsula, and down to Basra in Mesopotamia. So what happens is the Ottoman army that was formerly distributed all across the country now goes to the frontiers, leaving no combat forces in the interior. As we go into the spring of 1915, Ottoman intelligence is very good. There are no drones. There are no eavesdroppers electronically. So how do you get intelligence? You hire spies. You hire informers. Everybody does this. The Brits, the Russians are really good at it and always have been. So too are the Ottomans. So Ottoman intelligence knows a lot about not just the Armenians and the Kurds and the Jews who live in Gaza. They could be a problem, and the Arabs, but all manner of stuff about the Russians, the French, the British. They know all that stuff. What do they know exactly? They know a lot about the Armenian committees. They know they are committed to violence. They know that they have weapons. They know that they're positioned and ready to do something. They've had spies at the 8th Congress in Erzurum. The ARF, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, has had Congresses every couple of years. The latest one is in Erzurum, in eastern Turkey, in August of 1914. Here's what they find out through their informers. 2/3 of the delegates at the Armenian Congress are against participation in the war. That they think it's going to lead to a bad end. So most of the Armenian committee leadership at Erzurum says, we don't want to participate. We don't want to be in a war. We don't want to rebel. Another third, vocal, active, demand in the moment that the Armenians rebel. What happens to them? They go to Russia. Famous military leaders, Andronik and Dro and some others, they go to Russia across the border, friendly territory, where they raise Armenian volunteer regiments called Druzinis. There are 6 of these Druzinis. It's a word that translates to mean comrade, camaraderie. A good translation in a military sense would be a battalion or a regiment or a legion. So Armenians from the Ottoman Empire go across the border to Russia and raise regiments of soldiers. There's a quasi-war on the northeastern frontier. The Ottomans are trying to raise rebellion in the Russian Caucasus. The Russians are trying to raise rebellion in Ottoman Anatolia. There are escalating and accelerating acts of terrorism. I'll show you a map. What do I mean by this? Starting in December, officials are assassinated. Bridges are blown up. Telegraph lines are cut. Gendarme posts are destroyed, and the gendarmes killed. Local soldiers are lured out of barracks and killed or wounded. So there's a pattern, an emerging pattern of terrorist incidents. There's the threat to the Dardanelles, starting in February 14th. It's obvious the Brits and the French are going to come to Gallipoli. On the 18th of March, it culminates with a failed naval assault. On April 25th, they will actually land 70,000 people on the Gallipoli Peninsula. So they know that's coming. How come? Because the British publicize it. It's in the British papers. We're coming. We're going to liberate Constantinople. It's one of the worst OPSEC violations in military history. The last part that they know is the weakness of the lines of communications and the logistics of the Ottoman army in Anatolia. An army travels on its stomach. Soldiers need weapons, they need food, they need ammunition, they need medical supplies. That comes from the rear. And it's brought from the rear on what soldiers call lines of communications up to the front. The lines of communications that go into Afghanistan today, here's a neat thing. To get 1 gallon of gas for the army guys in Afghanistan today, it takes 7 gallons of gas to get it there from Karachi. Think about that. I got to get a gallon of gas to an American soldier in Afghanistan for his vehicle. It costs me 7 gallons of gas to move that from Karachi up through the Khyber Pass into Afghanistan. That's logistics. That guy needs the gallon of gas. If he doesn't get it, and 20 more like it, he can't move his vehicle. Same thing happens with ammunition. So that's what I'm talking about. It's all done in these days by muscle power, either men or animals. The railroads don't go to the front. These are the lines of communications. These are the roads. And you remember from a previous slide, there's an army up here. This is 600 miles down to the railheads. So you can bring stuff on railroads to about here, and then oxes and horses and men have got to move it up to here. 16,000 men do this, 20,000 animals do this, and they're constantly in motion. If you look at the cities that are inhabited by Armenian communities, you'll note they are dead on the major lines of communications. So this is looked at as a potential problem. Potential enemies are right on our lines of communications. What happens in Pakistan if they start blowing up fuel convoys to Afghanistan? That's a problem, and it's happened. What we see is a pattern of incidents that start in December. And there start to be incidents, assassinations, bombings, bridge blowing, We're blowing up bridges, telegraph line cutting, the assassination of animals, all kinds of things, not just people but animals. Poisoning wells so that animals can't drink. And the pattern looks something like this. The Turkish archives capture the mosaic and the pattern. So too do the Russian archives, so too do the French and British archives. So military men on all sides are tracking what's going on here. That's kind of what it looks like. How many terrorist incidents do you need to form in your mind the idea that we've got a problem? 2, 3, 20? Does it matter? It really doesn't matter, except in the fact that there are a lot of these things going on. The one that crystallizes and defines the problem is the rebellion at Van. Here's the front line in early April 1915. Here's the city of Van. There are those guys down. Contentious point. Who starts the rebellion? The Turks say the Armenian committee rises in rebellion. The Armenian committees and the Armenians say, no, the Turks started it by assassinating our leaders. It doesn't matter. It's an irrelevant point. The point is that in April 1915, Armenian committees have seized the Armenian quarter, the citadel, that rock thing on the picture, and the army barracks. And they're holding the city of Van. And they're heavily armed. So that's the outcome. We also know that the Turkish army, the Ottoman Turkish army, is gone. There's no real way to counter this. And shortly thereafter, a week after the seizure of the citadel, the Russian army attacks the front. And the 5 of the 6 Druzinis of Armenian volunteers are helping the Russians. Now, this is not a historical opinion, this is historical fact. You can read it in any book about the Caucasian Front in the First World War. What happens? The Turks can't hold the city. The city falls. Look at this. That's what it looks like at the end of the month. Remember, World War I is a war where progress is measured in yards. I'm crossing no man's land. If I can make it a mile, I've made a huge dent. So this is a war where progress is literally measured in yards. All of a sudden, the Ottomans have not hundreds of yards, but 60, 70 miles, a dent in their front. This only happens a couple times in World War I. It happens in the Michael Offensive in 1918. It happens in the Schlieffen Plan up until September. But this is a rare occurrence. This is what Ambassador Morgenthau, our man in Constantinople, sends back to the Secretary of State. And this is what he tells them. There's a rebellion out there. He doesn't say anything else. This is a State Department archival document. And this one of the Armenian guys who's leading the Drzini is helping the Russians. And oh, by the way, there are about 25,000 of these people. Now, this is wildly inaccurate. We know Morgenthau's memoirs, most of the time, are flat wrong. This one's flat wrong. There aren't no 25,000 people out there. Maybe it's a couple hundred. But by the time the messages get to Morgenthau, they get it wrong. Why do I bring this up? Morgenthau thinks it's a rebellion. Morgenthau thinks it's a rebellion. So too do the